So to start off, I wanted to give you a bit of an idea of what I would like to gain from the presentation, and then for you to sort of keep this in mind as I take you through my slides. So I am using this opportunity to get feedback on my proposed approach to my PhD thesis. So I'm in my second year, and I plan to do my fieldwork in the autumn. And I'd also like feedback on my understanding of citizenship education. So I come from an international relations and social science background. So today I'm really keen to gain an insight into which pedagogical writers' concepts and theories that I should be considering. So all thoughts are very welcome on this one. I'd also like to have some feedback on my plan to conduct focus groups and interviews with young people that left school quite recently, so within the sort of the past 2 to 5 years. And that's so that I can gather evidence on the impact of their schooling, in particular, the impact their citizenship education had on their social relations and how it helped them to understand the world around them. Okay, so we can start with the presentation now. Okay, so the title of my presentation talks about societies and transforming societies, but I'm really particularly focused on divided societies. So a divided society can be understood as one where groups live separate lives. These separate lives tend to be manifested through physical and social boundaries. So in Belfast, for example, you'll find the peace walls, and this is where you have particular localities that are associated with distinct identity groups, and then these are reinforced by the physical barriers, the peace walls. Other examples of divided societies include Cyprus, Lebanon, and Israel. So we have Nordlinger, who writes a lot about divided societies. He sort of kind of coined the term, and it's been developed on since 1972. And he writes that division of groups is often along lines such as religion, language, ethnicity, or race. And he says that it's political salience that is attached to these different groups that there then becomes potential conflict. And something that's quite distinct with divided societies is that there is a continuous risk of violence. And this characterizes everything. It becomes all-consuming. So it can be seen in economic, social, and cultural lives. And it really shapes how people live their life. So in this way, division seeps into every aspect, and choices become based on these different identity groupings. And it also shapes the divisions that we can see in things like education, housing, and other daily aspects of life. Unfortunately, what happens with this kind of separation is that it breeds mistrust, and it increases feelings of fear of the other. So because of limited exposure to other cultures and identities that exist within the same society, there are fewer opportunities to challenge divisive narratives. Dividing societies in a way that separates daily life, such as in education and housing, is a way of managing tensions, so it does not contribute to the process of transformation. Zembailos and Beckerman, they write that segregated schools are the norm in most contexts, and segregated schools often serve homogeneous identities, and these are based on religion, race, or ethnicity. So proponents of segregated schools see them as a way to protect cultural traditions, values, and practices of dominant groups, but also minority groups. So it can be that schools can teach, they can instruct in the language that is the chosen language of the particular group. So for example, in Bosnia, There are schools where they have one school building and they have three different ethnic groups that are taught in these schools, but they're all segregated and their language of instruction is their own language. So this is a way that segregated schools can sort of hold on to this language for them, and rather than having just one dominant language take over. But critics of segregated education, they argue that it continues to perpetuate divisions that were a feature of the conflict previously, and that it fails to challenge existing structures that support division across society. Okay, so for my research, I will be using Northern Ireland as a case study. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the history of education in Northern Ireland. And also within the backdrop of the history of education, we really need to talk about the conflict known as the Troubles. So this was happening between sort of from the 1960s until 1998. And this is when the Belfast Agreement was signed, and this brought about a cessation to a lot of the violence there. Not all of it, but most of it. The Troubles was brought about due to rising tensions between nationalist groups who are predominantly Catholic, and they favour uniting with the Republic of Ireland, and Unionists who are predominantly Protestant and want to remain part of the United Kingdom. So Gallagher writes that there has always been separate denominational schools in Northern Ireland, and this reflects the population that live there and have historically lived there too. So the question of who controls education in Northern Ireland dates back to the 1820s. So there's a very long history. So to give you an idea, we have the majority of the schools there are segregated. So we have controlled schools, and they are fully state funded and they're de facto Protestant. And then we have maintained schools. They're also state funded, but the control is retained by the Catholic Church and the Council for Catholic Maintained Schools. So there's over 90% of schools in Northern Ireland are segregated along these lines, but they do all adhere to the same national curriculum. So in the 1980s, there were a group of parents in Belfast that did not want to send their children to segregated schools. And so after a lot of campaigning, in 1981, the first integrated school was introduced. And an integrated school is one that aims to have 40% of children from a Protestant background, 40% from a Catholic background, and 20% from either an other background or no faith at all. But unfortunately, the expansion of integrated schools has been very slow. Last year in 2023, only 7% of Northern Ireland's pupils were attending an integrated school. So in response to this, this impasse, shared education was piloted in 2007. And shared education involves collaboration between separate schools. And this is where pupils and teachers move between schools to take classes on a regular basis. Schools that participate in shared education pool resources together. And this is how the project was sold to schools in order for them to sign up and take part. One of the main aims of shared education is for it to encourage intergroup contact, but that is not how they sort of sell it to schools. It's very much based on curriculum outcomes and the sharing of resources, and also the expanding of options within the curriculum. So, for example, a class from a maintained school may travel to a controlled school to have French class on a weekly basis because their own school doesn't offer French class. All their other classes are held at their own school, but but it means that on a weekly basis, they will be interacting from students from the other community. Each respective school retains their individual ethos, and they can choose the subjects that they want to share. So schools working as part of shared education, they often choose non-sensitive subjects, such as French or technology class. So in my view, both integrated schooling and shared education are different sort of interpretations of an integrated model or approach to education. But the difference is, I suppose, is that shared education is a bit more of a compromise. So they're moving away from complete segregation, but they're not fully adopting integration. So to tell you a bit about my my own thesis, my own project, what I'm planning to do is the empirical research for my thesis will involve assessing two interpretations of integrated education. So the ones I've just told you about, integrated and shared education in Northern Ireland. I will examine what I see as the necessary elements that contribute to the transformation of intergroup relations. And I see one of these as being citizenship education, or perhaps global citizenship education. I'm interested in the role that the educational environment has on the curriculum, and also vice versa. So specifically, I want to examine the impact integrated education and shared education, respectively, have on the teaching of citizenship education in Northern Ireland, but also the impact that citizenship education has on transforming intergroup relations in a divided society. Obviously, today I'm more focusing on citizenship education to make use of this conflict and the knowledge and experience that everybody has here. Okay, so moving on to global citizenship in education in divided societies. So I'm already quite familiar with literature related to divided societies and responses to societal division, particularly often through either segregated, shared or integrated schooling. These are the sort of three main approaches, particularly in Northern Ireland. I'm now moving on to global citizenship education research, and I would like to use this conference as a way to invoke a discussion. So I'd really love to hear your thoughts today. So across the literature, many writers consider the school curriculum as an important channel where transformative learning can take place, and particularly if students are given the space to explore different experiences of conflict, identity, and citizenship. I see that there is great potential for education to help shape students' values and perspectives of the world. I think that's probably something we all share here. And these sort of objectives sit quite well with citizenship education, and particularly global citizenship education. And I see that implementing comprehensive public education programs can play a role in addressing historical injustices, and can also develop a child's ability to participate in society. So traditionally, citizenship education, as I understand it, and as I found in the writing of, I'm not sure how we pronounce her name, but it's Gozan Jalala. So that the nation state is something that was traditionally focused on in citizenship education, and that there's sort of one national level of identity. Whereas when we move away from this and we go towards global citizenship education, it sort of encompasses a broader set of values of citizenship, and multiple levels of identity are emphasized rather than just one national identity. And it's that idea of interconnectedness. So global citizenship education is described as contributing to peace building, particularly as it draws on critical pedagogy, which is adopted as a tool to transform students' views and promote tolerant and democratic outlooks. So global citizenship education is frequently adopted in the wake of conflict to shape values to varying degrees. There's many examples all around the world of citizenship education being used in this way. So Warden and Smith write that values, attitudes, and behaviours learned through citizenship education socialise children about who may be regarded as a citizen, which shapes their perspective towards various groups, local regions, and people who come from elsewhere. And final slide here. So there are many challenges that are faced in citizenship education in Northern Ireland. So its current form was born in 2007, and it's known as local and global citizenship. And it's built on 4 interrelated concepts. So these are diversity and inclusion, human rights and social responsibility, equality and social justice, and democracy and active participation. So citizenship education in Northern Ireland has come to help young people develop the capacity to critically engage with the society in which they live, as well as the wider world. Unfortunately, to date, its citizenship education has not lived up to its potential. And Macaulay lists a number of challenges, which include teacher avoidance. So teachers, it's a global and local citizenship curriculum, but teachers tend to favour the global aspects of the curriculum. So they use this as a bit of a loophole, and so that they can avoid contentious local issues. We have social silence in Northern Ireland still. So there's a long history of avoiding anything conflict related. They just don't talk about it. And there really does remain a culture of silence about the past. There is a fear from within the classroom. So teachers often prefer to avoid controversy, and it then limits the opportunity to discuss and make sense of the past for the students. A teacher's background also has an effect. So teachers, they are human just like you and I. They are not blank slates. They have their own experiences and they take these into the classroom with them. And they may have direct experience of the previous conflict, of the troubles. And this can affect the way that they would like to or would not like to discuss issues of the past. And then also there's leave the past in the past. So there tends to be a common view that it's better to focus on the future and not dwell on the past. So these are just some of the challenges faced in Northern Ireland at the moment. So a number of studies conducted in Northern Ireland have found that young people themselves do want to learn about conflict-related issues at school. So they do want to learn about sectarianism, politics, identities, commemorations, but it would seem that unfortunately they don't often get the opportunity to do this. Macaulay notes that the classroom, and I agree with this, is a space where frank discussions need to occur, particularly as this uncomfortable space where transformation can take place. Classrooms can be a place where students are encouraged to challenge their deeply held values and those held by wider society. And it's a place where they can learn to listen and respect difference. Okay, so that's my presentation for today. And I have a few points here that I would like to discuss with you. So I just say thank you for your attention. And I look forward to hearing your questions and your feedback.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate the opportunity to present today. I want to talk about global citizenship education from a practitioner perspective. I will say, I've been interested in this field for a few years, as Caroline mentioned. Really, it started for me as an individual through my own trajectory also as a geographer working on the internationalization of higher education, but also working on certain conflicts in the world more with a geopolitical approach. And as a teacher too, what I realized was that, you will encounter some people and they will tell you that they are global citizens, but it was mostly through their own experiences, their own trajectories. And I wasn't sure that it was actually something I was instilling them through the school system and the schools they went through. And so it started to spark my, attention to the field. Then when I started working in international schools, and you could see I'm the academic director at the International School of Boston, I started wondering how we could actually provide students with the learning experiences that will allow them to really become global citizens. And parallel to that, we've seen from the past few years a renewed call for national systems, but also supranational organizations to really advance the cause of global citizenship education. UNESCO has done really good work, the Council of Europe, the European Union, but also other organizations that actually my school belongs to, such as the Council of International Schools, or the International Baccalaureate Organization, really pushing forward the concept of global citizenship education and even providing ways to actually teach students GCE in a very liberal approach. And talking to teachers, one also realizes that it's not that simple, and teachers sometimes don't really know how to conceptualize or define global citizenship education. They're really unsure about how to teach global citizenship education. And so as a secondary field, I became interested in that because as a practitioner, I had to, somehow teach students global citizenship education, but I was a little unsure about how to do that. So in this short presentation, I want to propose something, a model with 4 pedagogical strategies that could be helpful for educators to actually teach global citizenship education, to provide students with the learning experiences that will allow them to develop the competencies that will be necessary to become global citizen. I'm really keen on receiving your feedback about all of that. I haven't gone to a stage where I could actually test this model. So I'll be very curious to hear their thoughts about how to test potentially that particular model. And, I come from France, but I've been in the US for many years now. So is this model particularly US-centric? I'll be really curious to hear your thoughts also and see what you think about that. Very classic presentation. I want to start with some context, and I think it might actually give some insights into the last question we left the last presenter with, which was, a little bit of a missed opportunity or GC not reaching its potential. I think, I will certainly share that because even though it's in the Sustainable Development Goals, it's 2015, even though we have many calls to actually teach global citizenship education, we can see that it's actually complicated in the field to do so. There is what is called the crowding out of the curricula. So many mandates given to schools, teach STEM, numeracy, literacy, many things. And so there isn't a lot of space and time for global citizenship education. There are difficulties around developing a school-wide ethos, particularly for public schools. They've got many policies to implement, many mandates, political switches. That will be the case in France, for instance. So there is, again, a lot of space to teach global citizenship education. One of the main ones for me, particularly in the US, is the competition with nation-centric education curriculum. So really, there is citizenship education, certainly, but it's really nation-centric. So that's a big hurdle. There is a competition with the acquisition of global skills in a neoliberal fashion. That's certainly true in the US more than in Europe, but in the country I live in, it is actually very present. It's also happening to some degree in international schools where you've got a little bit of a dissonance between the discourse or the narrative around a liberal approach to global citizenship education, mutual understanding and appreciation for differences, very UNESCO centered approach versus what is actually told sometimes to the parents, the the individual advantages to actually being in international schools and having these global viewpoints, which is more neoliberal in fashion. The lack of curriculum material and teacher training in a lot of the teacher colleges, there are not courses about global citizenship education. The lack of consensus around what it is. We could see pretty much three strands: the neoliberal approach, the liberal approach, and the critical approach. And in this model, I'll try to focus mainly on the liberal approach with a little bit of the other two. And you'll see what I mean by that. And I've tried to respond to the calls from some authors out there to adapt global citizenship education to regional, national, and global dimension of citizenship. I think it's very important to be able to contextualize what we're doing as educators and researchers, and also the need to provide a framework that links GC with social justice and citizenship issues. So from that, the context for me is that the state of global citizenship education does not really allow students to be equipped with the knowledge, dispositions, and skills or the competencies to be able to really find solutions for this equitable, peaceful, and sustainable world. So you can see really the liberal approach here in my perspective. The research question for me has been, following this liberal approach, what pedagogical practices and learning experiences can really help students develop those competencies, the competencies that will be required to provide solutions for this more equitable, peaceful, and sustainable world. What I'm trying to achieve by that is really to help teachers understand what global citizenship is and why it matters, what they should really be worried about it and concerned about it, and try to actually give students learning experiences that will allow them to become global citizens. How can we help teachers possess a conceptual framework that is necessary to teach global citizenship education efficiently? And what are some examples? What are some units, scope and sequence? What are some pedagogical scenarios that would be necessary for the students to develop this KDS? Following this, liberal approach, I was doing a little bit of a literature review, and I found some models out there that are actually really good. There is a classic model from UNESCO about the fact that we should help students develop cognitive skills, social emotional skills, and behavioral skills. There is also the model from Oxfam that has been adapted by Putman and Baker, that is the Learn, Think, Act model. There is also the model from James Banks, the father of multicultural education in the US, focusing on the No Care Act. What I've seen is really a strand here, really commonalities between this idea of developing knowledge, dispositions, and skills that allow students to really build those competencies to be able to understand the world, care about the world, and being able to act collectively to actually find practical solutions to the issues that the world is facing. Locally first, but then from the local being able to expand to the national or regional and then the global scale. And then my hypothesis has been that hence some pedagogical practices and learning experiences can help students develop those competencies. And that furthermore, grouped together, they can act in synergy. And it's really what I'm trying to achieve with this model with 4 pedagogical strategies. And I'm sure those strategies might actually sound familiar to you, but the first one will be to really embed some dominant knowledge into carrier subjects. So carrier subjects are disciplines that, because of their scope and because of their content, are able to allow other knowledge, dispositions, and skills to be embedded within their particular units and scope and sequence. And so students can learn about global citizenship education related topic within the framework of these particular disciplines. For instance, we're going to learn about climate warming in the science class. The second one is what I call intercultural reading, and it's a mix of multicultural reading and really this approach of mirror and windows from Emily Style. And this is the idea that, by having an exposure to literary text, we could actually see the world from multiple viewpoints, and we could start to expand our view to see the world in all its complexity and all its beauty, but we could also have opportunities to see ourselves in text, the mirror and the windows. Project-based learning, of course, and the idea is that the project frames and is a vehicle for the learning. So the learning is embedded within the project where students are trying to hands-on solve real-world problems. And then finally, experiential learning, which is a little bit more than project-based learning because it's learning by doing, and it could be also service learning. So going out there and trying to achieve something for others, and by doing so, learning something. So service to learn and learning to serve, but also engaging students in hands-on experiences and reflection. So what does it mean in practice? What it means is, and that's a little bit the model, through career subjects, students will develop critical thinking. They will develop the domain knowledge, understanding. They will develop particular thinking skills around, for instance, critical thinking, and they will develop the understanding and knowledge of global trends and issues. So, for instance, understanding about inequality globally, global warming, understanding about conflicts, but also understanding about the major cultural areas. And it's absolutely necessary to have this knowledge, to have this understanding of the world, to be able to be a global citizen and go into the next stage that is actually caring and acting. So this one is more globally focused and focusing on the development of key knowledge and skills. The second one is intercultural reading. I've talked about it a little bit. For instance, students will read a book that talks about students that look like them, in having an experience in a neighborhood that is similar to them, developing their sense of confidence, sense of self, and actually sense of belonging. But they will also read books where students have experiences that are completely different, about a Somali boy or girl in Afghanistan. And there they will understand a little better what is our common humanity, but how people can live very different lives. And so hence developing a sense of empathy and appreciation for differences, basically what is in the realm of intercultural competence. Because it's reading literature, there is also about metacognition and critical thinking, having an ability to reflect on the text. As Henri Giroux said, you could read behind the text. What is the context, the social, historical context of the text? When was it actually written? What was the author trying to achieve? What was the author's life? What is the context of that particular society? You can read within the text, so more of a classic literary approach, if you will, and you can read in front of the text. What does it mean for me, this text? What is it that I find in the text that is actually relevant to my own life? And all of that, it can be very much globally focused, and development of key, particularly thinking skills, thinking abilities, so metacognition, critical thinking, and so on. The second two are more locally focused, project-based learning. And I've got an example here, an example I've developed in an article published recently. Conditional probabilities applied to public health in a high school math class. So students are presented with a scenario. It's a real-world problem where they have to use conditional probabilities to find and design a public health strategy for a particular city where there is a disease and they are public health officials and they have a budget and they have access to a vaccine and they have access to a treatment, but they don't have enough money to actually treat and vaccine everyone as they would like to do so. And so they have to find trade-offs and design the best strategy by using conditional probabilities. So they work as a group, they have to cooperate, they have to actually use mathematics, but apply it to that particular context to actually propose a public health strategy. So it's a very short example of what could be done. But then in that case, knowledge dispositions and skills will be cooperation skills, collaboration skills, communication abilities, but also critical thinking and problem solving. And then finally, experiential learning. Another example I have is something we've done in one of the schools I work at is, partnering with a local organization. It's called the Mystic River Watershed Association, and having students go into that particular watershed ecosystem, to study the ecosystem, have courses taught by the people from this local organization, but also start to go further and look at a particular problem, a problem of practice that this organization was facing. It was sewage overflow, and have the partnership between the organization and the students to try to find actually contextualize practical solutions to this problem that the organization was facing. So the students started to actually create drainage systems using what they've learned from the organization, what they learned from their science teacher, what they've observed on site, and they tried to find this contextual issue to a real world problem. And here they started developing particular disposition and skills: self-agency, self-efficacy, self-belonging, problem-solving skills, and obviously critical thinking. And you can see then that the last two are really locally focused, and they're focused on the development of key skills and dispositions. And my argument, or my hypothesis, if you will, has been that if you have the four acting in synergy together, a student can really start developing the key competencies, the key knowledge, dispositions, and skills that are necessary to really become a global citizen. Focus locally first, then being able to expand and use those competencies to more global, more national, more wider issues on a different scale. And so finally, conclusion and a little bit of the discussion maybe, what I was trying to show with this presentation is that implementing global citizenship education requires more than developing global skills in a neoliberal approach. It also requires a complementary approach between a national civics approach, but also a global citizenship or a global approach, and also a local approach. So really having a multi-scalar perspective. I consider this conceptual model with, I hope, the synergy between the four strategies. The core pedagogical strategies are experiential learning, project-based learning, and intercultural reading. They reinforce the development of those skills, but also it requires having access to core knowledge. And I think it could be taught systematically through a spiral curriculum, through career subjects. And a focus on these pedagogical strategies could really be applied locally first and then expanded to a global scale. I think if we're able to do that as researchers, as educators, we will equip students with the necessary knowledge, disposition, and skills, deep understanding of content, and dispositions to be able to instill really lasting change, which is for me what we are requiring from an efficient global citizenship education. Thank you.
As you will appreciate, this week has been about submitting the thesis. It was submitted late last night, so I can't quite believe it. Apologies for a less than polished presentation. I've chosen to share just a thin slice of my study, and I've prepared a selection of photos rather than the usual academic slides. So enjoy them. I'm going to use the term ISP in the presentation, which stands for International School Partnerships, but obviously it's quicker and I'm less likely to stumble over the words as well. So we've been partnered with a small rural school in Eastern Ghana for 20 years, working collaboratively on many projects, most of them funded through the British Council. Our partnership is perceived to be successful by the British Council, probably due to its long-standing nature. Our partnerships featured a lot in blogs, newspapers, webinars, and videos on social media. I'm quite aware that the publicity with a view to promote programmes such as connecting classrooms, that's why we're used and featured. And this is particularly evident when I view the finished article and I recognise what has been edited out. I find it interesting that the articles have not been made or promoted in Ghana. And I'm left wondering, where are the voices of the Ghanaian teachers of our partnership, and why are they not being promoted? And also, while we do appear to tick all the boxes of high momentum partnership frameworks, models which appear to dominate ISP discourses, the frameworks too are mainly Western-led and informed, no doubt due to the funders being European. So it was questions and observations such as those that led me to research the views of my Ghanaian colleagues, and I undertook a small-scale research project through UCL exploring the perceptions and applications of GCE within our Ghanaian-Scottish ISP. On completion, though, rather than experiencing a sense of closure, I was left feeling that the research was kind of incomplete. And I began to recall memories that didn't appear to fit into any research context, and I felt really pulled to explore the contradictions and conundrums within them, but without the restrictions of predetermined research questions. So my thesis applies a slightly less traditional format, and I present memory stories and writing as method to critically think, reflect, and analyse. And I draw influence from a rhizomatic methodology. And this has allowed me to follow and conjoin connections and ruptures within our partnership. So what did I unearth? Well, rather than simply tell you, I thought it might be more insightful to share with you just one of the memory stories, and I ask you to reflect on them. In doing so, I hope that it gives you a flavour of what I mean by sharing lived experiences through memory stories, but I'm also genuinely interested to hear what you hear, see and perceive as I tell them. And I'm really pleased that we've got Oye, I hope I pronounced it correctly, from Nigeria, and I think Simon from Ghana as well. Part of the reason I use memory stories in my work is the hope that they'll be used to stimulate further dialogue, questions and rhizomatic thinking with a view to developing ISPs. So just sit back, I know we're all tired, and just listen to one story which I've entitled The Newspaper Men. It's morning playtime in our Ghanaian partner school. The two men from the nearby big town are dressed in suits, and their camera, dictaphone and notepads seem to dominate the head teacher's brightly tableclothed desk. Their presence makes the small office feel even smaller and hotter than usual. Through the open shutters, I can hear the rhythmic claps and sing-song voices of children playing ampi. The smiling face of one brave little boy pokes through the shutter, and he waves at us before being shooed away by the adults. This scene takes place early on in our school partnership. A local newspaper has been invited to attend a special welcome assembly. Afterwards, the reporter is keen for his photographer to take a photo for the report. They ask, what have we brought with us to give to the school? Computers, PE equipment, or a box of books? I then explain that our partnership is an equal and reciprocal one based on education, not charity, so I've not brought such items. I sense that my response is not going down well with the reporter, and I will forever remember the look he gives me. To me, it is a mix of disbelief and disdain, and it's the first time that I have ever felt like the white stranger. He certainly looks at me as if I'm strange. I suddenly feel uncertain of my role, from my point of view and through the eyes of the reporter. I figuratively step back from the interview, not sure how I feel. Feelings of injustice for me, my Ghanaian colleagues, or all of us, and at the same time not wanting to offend or get things wrong. The Ghanaian school leadership team step in. I sit on the couch, eyes now fixed on the checkered pattern of the linoleum-coloured floor. I sip my water quietly, chewing around the corners of the plastic water bag. The Ghanaian head teacher and deputes sit at the table on white plastic seats and reiterate that our partnership is about education. Still though, both men, the reporter and the photographer, don't appear to understand or accept, or want to understand, accept, what is being said. The voices grow louder and slip into Chui. I am on the outside, the foreigner. After 10 or 15 minutes of lively exchange, we are instructed to stage a photo of me giving the Ghanaian staff and pupils some sports equipment that the school already have. I don't know whether to laugh or cry at the absurdity of the scene. So that was a story. I'll now share with you my reflections, and hopefully we'll still have time at the end for you to give me some feedback as well. I would love to know what your reflections are, or your perspective on the story or my reflections. So in the story, I read, while it was the reporters rather than the school who are choosing to promote essentialist viewpoints and perpetuate global inequalities, the situation reinforces Douglas Bourne's, observations that moving away from a charity mentality of ISPs is a complex one. He suggests that the starting point is possibly being at the point of realisation and understanding of the complexities, and this was such a moment. In that moment, I had not anticipated resistance to what I assumed at the time was good and forward thinking, nor had I considered that reinforcing essentialism, as I saw it, might sell newspapers. The situation left me feeling a mix of emotions, but I did initially feel quite righteous and indignant that I, or we, the Ghanaian teachers and me, was or were in the right, and that the newspaper men were wrong to present something that was false or untrue, and so full of stereotypical assumptions about the West. While I felt justified at that time in my reasons for not giving the school PE equipment or computers, the incident has niggled at me, and I only now begin to question my reasons. Here I was, the benevolent outsider, the white female educationalist from the West, the key player in accessing the partnership funding, so holding much power and bringing nothing of material value or use. So why did I not give resources to the school? Well, at that time, the related professional learning courses of our funding body advised that school partnerships should not be charity-based to avoid fostering stereotypes and creating a power imbalance. I understood that funding from north to south could create dependency, and I enthusiastically and unquestioningly embraced the good intention of developing the thinking of teachers, parents and pupils beyond a charity mentality towards one that focused on shared educational aims. I also shared my reasoning with the teachers in our partner school, but looking back, I don't remember asking for their opinions, nor did they question mine. Looking back, I now realise that simply stating the Western rules changes nothing. Indeed, it could well have reproduced the dominating voice of Western knowledge and rule that intensifies essentialist thinking. Reading back the original diary entry that I wrote, and even the first draft of its adaptation, I can hear whispers of my own Western assumption in the words of the texts. This realisation surprised me because for as long as I can remember, I've considered myself to be open-minded and of a post, non or decolonial mindset. Through my reading, though, I can now associate with Andreotti's sanctioned ignorance, where I was guilty of not considering the subtler colonial discourses which may have been at play. Was the fact that I had taken resources across with me an example of global north or neo-colonial dominance? That quietly shouted, West knows best about how to ensure a successful partnership. And who was I to announce that good school partnerships should not involve charity? And were the Ghanaian teachers really convinced of what they were arguing for? Or were their arguments being perceived as a Western example of complicity in maintaining a global north or neo-colonial dominance? Even now, at the end of the thesis, I still have no answers to these questions. There may have been all, none, or some of these things going on, consciously or subconsciously. Years have passed, but it's only now that I consider that the reason the memory remains imprinted on my brain is because I may have been wrong. Maybe, or at least not completely in the right. Maybe it was me who had not been listening. Looking back, I can now see why the newspaper men in the story may have reacted in such a strong manner. A clash of l'affectation, where both the reporters and I are being affected and being affecting. And to finish, moreover, what the journalists portray in their report and the photographs affects the readers of the newspaper. And at the beginning of this presentation, I spoke of our partnership being promoted through various media. I mentioned that journalists have at times changed or omitted my words to put a certain spin on a story. Interestingly, it's usually an essentialist spin, much like the newspaper reporter who features in my memory story. But am I any different to the newspaper reporters? What do my words create, and who benefits from my retelling of stories in this thesis? In many ways, I too am writing my own single story, selecting words that carry with them a particular way of reading and evoking a response from the reader. And I don't have time to share the wider findings. They were mainly relational, emotional, and the importance of unlearning. But I would be interested if we have time to just know what your perspectives or reflections of the memory story or my reflections of them are. Thank you.
So I'll be actually talking about digital storytelling and identity formation, exploring the experiences of second-generation migrant youth. So just to give you a quick overview of today's, so first I'll explain the study and how we actually how we came to work with young people, and then I'll kind of summarize main findings, and then we'll move on to watching the video and the discussion. But first, maybe just to give you a context, just a little bit information about where I'm coming from with all this. So in Ireland at the moment, every fourth child being born in Ireland is born to a foreign-born mother. So currently, Ireland has one of the highest proportions of foreign-born residents in EU. And at the same time, when you look at the school structures, it's very much monocultural, and there are some assumptions and low expectations for children coming from minoritized backgrounds. And in this particular moment, we've also started experiencing significant increase in demonstrations directed towards migrant refugees and asylum seekers in Ireland. I don't know if you've heard or watched it in the news. Hopefully it didn't go that far. But in May last year and in November, we've had two major incidents that actually ended in the riots in the city centre. So as you can see, there's a lot going on around those issues. And in 2020, the centre that I work for, so the Centre for Human Rights and Citizenship Education, started collaborating with Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. And we actually submitted a report on experiences of second-generation ethnic minority young people in Ireland. It was a big scoping study with systematic literature review and empirical component. So the findings, some of the findings that were there were around identity and belonging, and representation, racism, discrimination, and microaggression, like actually a lot of all-present microaggression, and the way it was impacting the well-being of young people. And then we looked, as part of the study, we had to look at some barriers as well. But what's important for today's presentation is that representation, and especially authentic representation, came as a very powerful facilitator to integration and inclusion in that, context for these young people. And that's how we actually ended up with our current study, and that's the integrating our voices across teacher education. I don't think I've mentioned that, but in Ireland at the moment, the teaching population is not very representative of the student population. So there's less than 2% of teachers claiming any kind of mixed background. So it's very, very much homogenous. And there are initiatives underway to actually, we're trying, to do something about that, but it's very slow. So this project, we thought, what if we can do something, about that, at least give those young people, some voice. So what we did, and what actually, again, came as a finding from the previous study, was very much that any research and any initiatives that we are doing should be done with young people, not about them, not for them, but with them. And we then decided to go for a participatory action research approach with some ethnographic elements to give them that kind of opportunity. So young people that worked with us were very much involved in our advisory committee. So any decisions that we've made as part of the project, we've made with them. They were involved in field work, and then in photo voice and ethnographic interviewing, and then later in production of digital storytelling. So photo voice, so first, initially we decided to go for a photo voice as a digital storytelling tool with young people. And we actually, young people like that very much, because we actually kept it quite open. So we've only worked, we had a theme, we've had different themes, and then they could actually bring and talk about anything they really wanted, anything that was important in this particular, moment, or reflected their experiences. So in a way, and then we at the end of that process, we had accumulated loads of different narratives, loads of different stories, loads of different, but also there were very valuable discussions, and like around difficult topics as well, very rich and very deep. So what we decided to actually, we then went back to our advisory committee. So our advisory committee included young people themselves, but also some academics. So we've consulted, and we decided to go and create digital version that could actually be shown and incorporated into teacher education programs and workshops for in-career teachers. We got a little bit, some additional funding to actually cover our work with media company, and together we produced, it's almost like a half-an-hour documentary. It's the process nearly finished, but we're at the moment we have a trailer and we have a few videos. So I intend to actually show you the trailer maybe first, and then if we have time, I can show you one more video. So maybe I'll explain how it works. So the title is Brave, and it's a series of short digital stories about identity, belonging, racism, and creating better future. The videos are based on the research project, and were co-produced with the research team and young people. Okay, so maybe let's watch it, hopefully. So I'd like to put that, quote, like the quote, maybe to inform our discussion. So providing spaces for student teachers to interrogate their own perspectives, preconceptions, and biases, and helping them to recognize those perspectives as situated as having an interest, enabling them to recognize power differentials and understand how they impact on society and on education at macro and micro levels. And my question would be, because we've started incorporating the videos, we've started designing workshops for the students, and we started working with sustainable, culturally sustainable pedagogy. But we've piloted, the videos, but the feedback so far was that, for example, there were loads of students who, after watching the videos, would get back to us saying that they were feeling guilty, if they were not coming from minoritized backgrounds. So this was not what we wanted. So there were loads of there's loads going on for them too, So if there's any kind of feedback or any kind of, I don't know, should I stop sharing? Maybe.
Thank you so much for the nice presentation. And yeah, this presentation is part of my ongoing doctoral research project, and the title is Preparing Primary School Teacher at University, Student Teachers and GC, a comparative study between Italy and Ireland. This is what I would like to cover today in terms of what would be relevant for a general understanding of the project, the aims, the structure, but also an overview about the preliminary findings I get until this moment through my data analysis. To give a brief idea related to the conceptual framework and summarize its relevance, is essential to mention the teacher education as the panacea through which improving education in schools and preparing quality teachers for the 21st century. So in this field, the role of teachers and the training system has been discussed widely, and it stressed also the importance of bring out the educational awareness of future teachers already in the initial training. Furthermore, the literature lacks a contribution that directly investigate the pre-service teachers and their preparation, which could be the proof of the efficacy of the current educational system. In addition, in this time of change and emergency, one of the three main pillars of this conceptual framework is investigating the global citizenship education framework. To understand how within the initial teacher education programs, the global citizenship education concept is integrated and perceived as well by the main actors in the field, such as the student teachers, teacher educators, and stakeholders. Mainly the student teachers that are later on entering the school system reality. I don't know how to move on. Okay. Here are examples of literature gaps related to global citizenship education within the initial teacher education. Actually, Damiani writes about the importance of service teachers training on global citizenship education, and actually in her very recent work, Lorenzo merged also the concept of teacher identity and within the global citizenship education, and stress as a problem the lack of support to incorporate the concept within the initial teacher education at the university level as well. So just to for the positionality, the global citizenship education definition has been extensively defined in the last decades. It's crucial, although position yourself as a researcher in this field. For the present research, I choose the definition of the up-to-date Dublin Declaration, and it expressed the idea of education as a transformative practice and process while developing critical reflection in the formal and informal sector. So the research question here presented reflect mainly the conceptual framework, focusing at first at the beginning to the broader initial teacher education sector and the development of the teacher's role. And the second one is mostly related to the aspect of GC understanding within the institution of initial teacher education. The framework and the design of the research relies on a comparative education structure. For this reason, we can also affirm, based on the literature, that there are beneficial aspects to conduct comparative studies, such as identifying best practices, supporting the policy development, cross-national collaboration, and incentivize global practices, which would be also the aim of the research. The methodological approach that developed the aims of the project is organized through a qualitative design. In particular, the study is structured through multiple case studies. There are 3 units of analysis selected in 2 countries, Italy and Ireland. As I said, the cases have been selected based on a comparative criteria chosen in advance. In precisely, actually, the comparative criteria have been set through document analysis and a long ethnographic field observation. The participant selection was based on a purposive process, and after that was run a phase of snowball this process, actually. The study considered in total 3 types of categories of participants. They mainly are student teachers, but also teacher educators and stakeholders in the field. The number is slightly different for each context of the analysis, for a total of 57 participants in the research. The data collection ran in 2023 and January 2024 and implies different tools of analysis. The document, first of all, the document and curricula analysis, participant observation in the field, in-depth semi-structured interviews, and also focus group. It's important to mention actually that the first two tools were used mainly to gain a more in-depth understanding of the context and explain better the data analysis conducted about the semi-structured interviews and focus group later on. Part of the comparative criteria that I mentioned before presented are based on the document analysis that I've run for the project at the beginning. Considering the differences, different layers of documents related to global citizenship education concept and implementation, I can present in both countries that both countries can have actually a national strategies to implement at the formal and informal level global citizenship education. The policy document that refer explicitly to the initial teacher education involved a specific pillars. So one of the 7 pillars in this document is to implement in the initial teacher education in Ireland the global citizenship education, while in the Italian one shows there are shown just the main topics in which the GC can be seen as transversal and implicit topic. In the university curricula, there are no specific modules in the Italian context, but every discipline is going this direction to refers to it in some way, while in the Irish context, there are mandatory and elective modules, but also the DICE project works in this direction since 20 years now. In the school system that is not investigated through the research directly, but is important to understand the wide field of the two countries. There is an upside down situation in which there is a sort of GC subject within the school system, while in the Irish context there is now integrating the active citizenship as a subject, and at the moment is under review, actually the curricula for primary school. For the analysis, I chose to analyze the data through the qualitative content data analysis, mainly following Cookers, that is the author of the methods. In particular, the type of QCA that I choose is the structuring QCA. Moreover, the main categories has been created from the semi-structured interviews based on the literature review. So we can say that are theory-driven and interview-driven. Considering the amount of data I've got, I decided, as suggested by Cookers, for the first cycle to analyze the 50% of every cases. And from these, using the MaxQDA software, and from these, I've developed the subcategories, checking also with the critical friends. The subcategories are have been created based on the a deductive process, while the other ones were inductive. I merged two process, the deductive and inductive, to create the category system and to apply later on to the whole amount of data. So, based on the data gained until now and analyzed until this moment, I can present a brief overview about my preliminary findings, specifically related to the first result that I've presented at the beginning. For the Italian context, student teachers do not feel confident for their teacher role without other additional experiences. They ask didactic inputs to apply immediately in the school system. They are afraid to enter the school system, and they have high awareness about their role when they are exposed to reflective practices, which is not always very common.
Giulia, 5 more minutes to the end.
In the Irish context, student teachers feel prepared but stressed by the standards, and the perception about their role reflect the ITP approach, so the initial teacher education approach, and the values behind this type of pedagogy. So at the bottom of the program, behind the program actually, which is always it's different between the initial teacher education programs in the Irish context. Sorry. I don't know why. Okay. Okay, sorry. Related to the research, the second research question, in the Italian context, the understanding about GCE is based mainly on personal experiences. There is a vague definition of global citizenship education, and there is a superficial awareness. The main idea related to the concept is going to is based on interdisciplinary topics or interconnection between these disciplines present in the program. There is an absence of input and ideas about how to teach global citizenship education in the school system. So students, teachers at the end of their program do not feel prepared to teach global citizenship education in the school system. In the Irish context, there is an explicit, as I presented through the document analysis as well, there is an explicit reference to the global citizenship education concept. There are methodological inputs and integration in the modules are shown, both in mandatory and elective modules. There is an understanding about the topics of GC and the awareness about the implementation in the school system. Furthermore, even if there is awareness related to the concept, there are still doubts related to the practical difficulties in implementing the concept in this school, So to find a space in the curriculum to further bring this concept in one subject or another. Hopefully, this situation will change since they are integrating this subject in the school curriculum and is at the moment under the review in the Irish context. This is my reference. Actually, I've done, and I have also prepared some other slides but maybe we can just start to discuss, and if something is needed, I can show it later, more related to the methodological aspect.
My abstract was the power of language and why global citizenship education won't work without the revised language curriculum. I am a theoretical and conceptual researcher, so I didn't really bring any data, just a lot of thoughts. And so I invite you today to go with me on what we call in German Gedankenspaziergang, a mental walk, if you will. So I want to talk about A Tale of Twin Sisters. I want to talk about the connection between language education and global citizenship education. And that will be the part that I promised in the abstract. But then literally a week ago or so, I decided to make language pedagogy of hope the focus of my work in the future, in the coming years. So I will shift and hopefully elegantly transition around the 10-minute mark towards a pedagogy of hope, which will be embedded in a global citizenship informed language education or a language education for sustainability and global citizenship. So let me start with A Tale of Twin Sisters. Carlos Torres, who we've heard of today many times, and he used this idea of elective affinity to explain the relationship between global citizenship and sustainability. And this idea goes back to Max Weber. The argument is basically that the notions of sustainability and global citizenship, as well as their respective education, enter a relationship of reciprocal influence, mutual selection, and reinforcement. In other words, if we are to achieve either of them, the other one needs to be achieved as well. So based on SDG 4.7, there are several other twin sisters, and I know that I'm bending the idea of a twin sister here, but bear with me. We have sustainability, global citizenship, socio-environmental justice, human rights, children's rights, peace, gender equality, cultural diversity. To achieve any one of them, we need to achieve all. And that, from my perspective as a language educator, necessitates and includes language, communication across boundaries, dialogue, argumentation, and listening. And so here's my central argument for this first part, that we have a family of twin sisters, And there's another sister, language education, which makes the family work, which is an integral part of the family, the social kit, if you will. And so the link between language education and global citizenship then emerges from this. Translated into a picture, the argument might look somewhat like this. We have a jigsaw, right? And language education is an integral piece of it. Translated into a concept, I and a few others, for instance, Joshua Jodoin, who works in Japan, use the term of language education for sustainable development to highlight that sustainability and global citizenship are not only worthwhile topics in the language classroom, which they sometimes are already, but actually serve as underlying orientations of language education altogether. And if we agree on the fact that communication and language play vital roles in the project of education for sustainability and global citizenship, we also acknowledge that if we don't pursue these goals consistently, global citizenship and sustainability are not going to work as intended. And sadly, language curricula across the world don't really follow this idea, but I would argue work actively against it. Language education here in this presentation and in the German context is understood as education of language, the communicative skills and strategies required to participate in discourses in another language. But it's also understood as education in language. So the critical and the cultural literacies that are required to participate in discourses in another language. So let us examine Germany, where I'm from. Germany consists of 16 federal states, and all of these federal states have their own sets of curricula, because we also have a very tiered educational system. But that's beside the point. The main point is that across Germany, in all 16 states, for all school forms, we find target country and target culture teaching in language education, especially in English language education. That's what the focus of this slide is. What I mean by that is that learning scenarios are centered around certain figures, certain characters, certain people that may or may not be real, to engage learners more in learning. And these learning scenarios are based in England in the 5th and 6th grade. Learners will be 10, 11, 12 years old at this point. In 7th grade, we move to the United Kingdom from England, broadening the perspective, but still the context are Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland sometimes, and Ireland. 8th grade, always United States, across the board. 9th grade, Australia, almost across the board in Germany. 10th grade, curiously, we leave the nation focus in most states and focus on global issues and also go into topics-based curriculum. And then in most advanced learners classes across Germany, we ditch that again, or maybe even resolve it a little bit with topics based on global focus. And we still have target countries. In North Rhine-Westphalia, where I work, we used to have India, and now we have Nigeria. So what this does is what William Godelli put so eloquently: we teach our youth to think like nation states. And that's what we do in the English language classroom. But that's not only a German phenomenon. Rather, we also find this type of teaching in other contexts, such as, for instance, in this case, Denmark. This is a fascinating, and truly I can recommend this book, Global Citizenship Education and Praxis, Pathways for Schools, edited by Schulz and Blom. But really, this is a book written by the Reisenstein upper secondary school colleagues, the team, in a grammar school in Copenhagen. And they describe the whole school approach that they chose for their upper secondary level. So the whole school in upper secondary is geared towards global citizenship. And this includes extracurricular activity, this includes the administration, and this includes the subjects themselves. And so, of course, as a language educator, when I read this book, I immediately jumped on the language chapters, and we have one from reporting from English, and we have one reporting from French. The English one is about cultural identity and human rights issues in Hong Kong. The French one deals with the idea of a French national culture, seeking to transcend stereotypical representations, and then focusing on a comedy film contrasting Congolese immigrant families and French national cultures. And what is really well intended in terms of resolving and kind of transcending stereotypical representations to dismantle the idea of fixed and static cultures is still focusing on national cultures to do so. That's basically what is known as the intercultural trap. And so this is not the type of global citizenship education that builds interconnectedness and that raises awareness for interdependencies on a global scale, I would argue, on a cultural level. But this is the kind of global citizenship education, a neoliberal, a nation-focused type, an intercultural type that creates an us versus them dynamic. It's a very well-documented fact that global citizenship education and related perspectives, such as intercultural communication or human rights, for instance, are taught in an outward projecting way in many European countries. We tend to look at human rights violations and the dire situation of human rights across the world, and we problematize aspects of cultural learning in other countries, other than the ones we're in. But we're doing so in an outward projecting manner. So we never look inward. We never embark on the walk within, as William Godelli calls it, self-reflection, our own positionality, and how things are in our own context, and what we can do about it locally. And that's not necessarily taken into account, but it's a crucial second step towards what they are, or adding on what they already do, projecting outwards. And language education is prone to this, I would argue, because culture and cultural learning play such a big role. But the way we conceptualize culture makes all the difference. So I and many others have argued to move beyond this idea of intercultural learning and this idea of intercultural learning. What I'm brushing over right now is that the intercultural discourse knows many other concepts of cultural learning, but this is the one that is dominant in our curricula. To move beyond this and use concepts of cultures that are also being discussed and more clearly and consistently align with the goals of global citizenship education and ESD, such as cosmopolitan language education, for example, and Fadila just mentioned that as well. So my argument is that language education can become the missing link, the centerpiece of the jigsaw, if you will, but we're not quite there yet. And from here, though, we can observe a multitude of highly interesting and promising research trajectories, including, but by no means limited to, anti-racist language education and approaches towards decolonizing language education across the world, and especially in Europe and what we know as the West. And I too take this baseline as a point of departure for my postdoc project, which focuses on language pedagogy of hope. This is embedded in everything that I just said in a language education for sustainability and global citizenship. And in the remaining minutes, I give a glimpse into what I mean by that and what this project could entail. I'm at the very, very, very beginning of this road. And this is the first time that I ever talk about language pedagogy of hope as my postdoc project. So I'm grateful for any comments, any guidance and thoughts you might have, particularly with regard to promising research projects that you can identify here. We start with one of the most influential current philosophers, certainly for me, that is the case, Bayo Akomolafe. In an address he gave on the question whether there is a solution to the climate crisis, he dared his audience to ask this question: what if the way we think about and respond to the crisis is part of the crisis? And this prompted me as a language educator to ask, what if the way we teach and learn to speak about the crisis is part of the crisis? And I wrote down some thoughts in this paper, and some of what I'm going to tell you in a little bit is based on this paper. So if you're interested, it's open access, and you can just download it. But you could also just listen to me in the next few minutes. My observation from textbooks and my own experience as an educator and from talks with my fellow colleagues working at schools, that tells me that we learn to speak about the crisis in terms of languages of fear, despair, of catastrophe. And that's not only true for schools, but in our everyday lives as well. The pedagogies of discomfort are being discussed and need to be acknowledged as very powerful. And I would subscribe to the idea that there's a time and place for this type of pedagogy where we think about the urgency, right? Bringing awareness to the urgency of the situation, to sensitize for the urgency of the situation. But our youth do not need to be sensitized anymore. A recent trend study conducted with youth in Germany finds out that they're extremely desperate and extremely pessimistic about their own future. They are painfully aware of the situation we're all in, both with regards to climate, loss of biodiversity, but also wars, pandemics, and the like. Nita's, in a presentation earlier, mentioned the fact that the social and the environmental can never be separated. So socio-environmental injustices are not a contradiction, but a necessary insight. So I would argue that we should never stop here in our pedagogy to sensitize for the urgency, but we should use pedagogies of discomfort as a stepping stone towards pedagogy that doesn't leave students with a sinking feeling in their guts, but much rather with strategies to deal with anxiety, anger, and despair, and crucially, a host of alternatives to giving up and to giving in to despair. In other words, a pedagogy which helps learners explore visions of hope for a better future. And of course, we all know there's a lot of literature out there which helps us contour what hopeful pedagogy might look like, especially in the context of language education and in the context of language education for sustainability and global citizenship. Among others, of course, we have Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of Hope and Bell Hook's Pedagogy of Hope teaching community. And also very current Doug Benn and Massimiliano Tarozzi's Pedagogy of Hope for Global Social Justice. It's exciting times for hopeful education right now. So based on that, what do we actually mean by hope? Upon first talking about hopeful pedagogy and hopeful language pedagogy, I was, and I still am, written off as an idealist with a cheesy outlook on life and education. And perhaps that's true to some extent. Perhaps I'm a little idealistic. I certainly am an optimist, but perhaps that explains why I work in education in the first place. And maybe a little bit of positivity is needed to set out to explore pedagogies of hope. And while this certainly has to some extent has to do with a mindset and an attitude as an individual, research into hope from fields such as psychology, sociology, philosophy, and many more tell us that there's much more to it. We can differentiate between passive hope, which is kind of wishful thinking, and that can be very harmful and also very paralyzing. But we distinguish that from critical or radical hope, which is hope based in the status quo, based in a critique of the status quo to identify concrete steps towards better future and towards the transformation of the status quo. Ojala calls this a developing pathway thinking towards a future which is not yet, which I think is a beautiful phrase. And we can see this reflected, this shift towards acknowledging that there's much more to it, in not only in the fact that there are so many new books on why hope matters. For example, we have Not Too Late. It's a compelling compilation of short stories and short essays that I highly recommend. We have Hope Matters, which is an inspiring book arguing that evidence-based hope is our most powerful tool for transformation. And we have Corinne Pelluchon's L'Espérance ou la traversée de l'impossible, with an philosophical essay arguing that the vulnerability of society and the possibility of social collapse offers opportunities for change and generates hope. Hope here is less of an attitude and a mindset, more of a skill, something that you can apply, something that you can develop and nurture. And this boils down to one thing in the educational context, that's agency. There is a clear goal towards which we need to work. None of this happens magically. Learners need to be recognized as active agents of change so that they can assume a position in which they can work towards a future which is not yet. And that can be hands-on, but it can also be communicative. And the language classroom offers unique opportunities to serve as a space of hope, because besides a focus on the linguistic components of language learning, and actually applying languages of hope, languages of peace, in order to communicatively work towards hope and peace, we can also focus on stories of hope and transformation, which offer stories revolving around socio-ecological justice, human rights and more than human rights, and global citizenship to the learners via short stories or via literature. So we could argue that dystopian texts already invite learners to take a new twist on them and turn them into hopeful visions of the future. But I would say that is true, but only to some extent, because the vocabulary and other linguistic features, as well as unique narrative aspects unique to utopian fiction, that makes up languages of hope and advocacy, are much rather provided in stories that are inherently hopeful and don't have to be turned hopeful, such as solar punk and hope punk fiction and non-fiction. I brought a compilation of a few works here. Solar punk is a genre that is very much rooted in the status quo. It's not solely utopian, not solely hopeful, but it turns hopeful and gives us visions of what a good future, a better future, a more just future could look like. And so to sum this up and transition into the discussion and into questions, I'm talking about critical hope, which is rooted in and acknowledges the status quo. It critiques the status quo and eventually seeks to transform it. This hope is not an attitude, it's not idealistic dreams, it's not passive, but it's hope as a skill, hope as transformative force that is linked to the three central notions of goals thinking, pathway thinking, and agency thinking. And this translates to the pedagogical pillars of agency, future orientation, task-based language learning, and critical pedagogy. And so these inform pedagogy that helps learners develop their potential as change agents, but crucially, it also helps us define educators as change agents in the context of hopeful pedagogy. And so based on this insight, I'm thinking about research projects that help me, first of all, contour and conceptualize, contextualize hopeful language pedagogy vis-a-vis critical pedagogy, for example, cultural learning, global citizenship, and sustainability. I also have in mind to research the role of culture, literature, and language in language education and how to turn this hopeful and what role these aspects of language education can play. How this will be implemented in classroom practice, both conceptually and with a look at material and task design principles, but also empirically, and how we can operationalize hopeful language pedagogy. And then, of course, I'm also interested in language educators and learners' attitudes towards hopeful approaches. And that's all I've got so far. Thank you very much. This is a picture of Munster, by the way, where I work. And if you want to come to Munster at some point, maybe March next year, you're very welcome to send in your submissions for our International Conference on Language Education for Sustainable Development. CFP is still open, 1st of August. Thank you so much for your time and also for your input later on.
So for my presentation today, I am trying to do two things. So I am going to talk to you about a completed study. So it's my completed PhD research, but also where I'm going next with it. So what my current project is in relation to the findings from it. So I graduated with my PhD 2 years ago, and the main outcomes from my PhD were developing a framework for critical thinking within the context of global citizenship education. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that. So for today, I will tell you a little bit about the research project, its origins, and the purpose of it. I'll talk to you about why a framework, like why was that the outcome of the project. I'll give you some details of the framework, but there won't be enough time to go into that in full detail. And then talk to you about the adaptation process, which is what I'm going through now at the moment, and where this might go next. So the context that this takes place within is really important. So I work within initial teacher education. It's primary level initial teacher education. So the primary school context informs a lot of the pedagogy and the approach that we use. And it's based in Ireland, so in the Republic of Ireland as well. So that context is very specific. To tell you a little bit more about that, so in my institution, in each year group, I would have about 450 to 500 students in each year group. And so when I am teaching them core global citizenship education modules, all students have access, all students must take those modules. But I'm teaching really large cohorts. And within that, I teach in groups of roughly 60, which means I teach the same thing 7 or 8 times in a week. So the context is challenging in that sense. So for this research project, I was particularly interested in critical thinking. So how critical thinking interacts with global citizenship in this context of initial teacher education. So when I began my PhD, I had already been working as a teacher educator for, I think, 2 years, and so had taught these core modules in global citizenship education a couple of times so far. And what I found was that students at the end of a module were really good at telling me that they were critical thinkers, and so their perceived skill level was really high, but I found that their demonstrated skill level was pretty low. So in assessments, in class work, I wasn't seeing much evidence of this criticality that they felt ownership of and they felt like they had. So the missing piece had to be myself and my teaching practices. So what was the link that was causing this gap? So without reading everything on this very busy slide, if you listen to my voice, I can walk you through it and make a little bit more sense. I did self-study action research. So I combined self-study methodologies with action research methodologies. So I did 3 cycles of traditional action research where I reflected, planned, acted, observed, made changes, and did so again. So in the first cycle, so this took 3 years. So in the first year, I taught as normal as I used to do, and observed what was happening. And then each cycle I made a few more changes and observed what was happening. To collect data from students, there was lots of different ways. So there was focus group interviews, there was surveys. I collected assessments and evidence from what they were doing in class, because this is where I hadn't seen the criticality before. And I think my favorite methodology that I used is called Most Significant Change Stories, which it comes from development practice originally, but it's a methodology where you allow people to identify for themselves what was the change, what caused that change, where did it come from? And that gave me some of the richest data that I had in the PhD. In addition to this, because it was a self-study piece as well, there was ongoing, never-ending reflections and conversations with critical friends. So I had 2 critical friends who engaged with me on it. So while this might have looked messy, this is the clean version of the methodology, and the lived reality of the methodology is much messier. So when we talk about action research, there's these nice clean loops as if it's one cycle after another, but the reality is you go through an action research cycle of reflecting and planning and acting and changing on a weekly basis, and sometimes on an hourly basis or on a daily basis. So there were loops within loops of making changes, and I was very lucky to work with a critical friend who was co-teaching the modules with me. So we could have these ongoing debates and discussions like, oh, that methodology didn't quite work, it didn't do what we wanted, and how can we fix it and adapt it? So that's what it looks like. So the outcome at the end was that I created a conceptual framework. For a number of different reasons, and this framework was developed across the 3 years and the 3 cycles and finalized at the end once I had all of my data. So I had tested it in different versions and different phases throughout those 3 cycles. I found it really important to have a structure and a framework to ensure that we remained focused on what was the key learning objectives. Global citizenship education is massive, it's huge. Defining critical thinking is so complex and difficult that I needed something to help me keep focused and know what it was that I was trying to do at all times. I found that a structured approach was really helpful. I'm not naturally a very structured person, but having structure in teaching is very helpful both for educators and students to make sure that we know things are predictable and we know what's going to happen. It supported a variety of student contexts because I have 450 to 500 students. It's very difficult to meet all of those students exactly where they are. So the structure I developed helped me in my context to respond to the differences within those large groups, to teach in large groups, and it helped me to work collaboratively with others because I was not the only teacher or lecturer on these courses. So this is what the conceptual framework is. So it's a 2-part conceptual framework. So the first part, and I'm going to talk you through it a little bit more so it'll make a little bit more sense, but it's got a model and then a planning tool. So if we think of the model as part A, the model helps us to understand what is, and I use the term critical global learning as that intersection between critical thinking and global citizenship education. So if you're prepared for the model to look even more challenging, this is what it looks like. I think it looks like a sea creature, but to talk you through it, everything moves around the central commitment to criticality. So if we don't have this central commitment, it's very difficult to do anything else. On one hand, we have 2 arcs that move around our central commitment. So the right-hand arc that's in green tells us, well, what are the skills? So I was really struggling to know what did I need to look for in my students, and I didn't like the critical thinking tests that were out there because they didn't link enough to global citizenship for me. So I created a framework of 4 core skills that I needed to look for. So these are developing and using a global learning knowledge base, questioning orthodoxies, engaging in self-reflection, and then using a values lens. And then they each have, as you can see, their own sub-skills within it. So now I know, what do I need to develop in students? What do I need to look for when I'm looking for evidence of success? On the left-hand side, the blue arc, we have considerations for teaching. So what do I need to be aware of as the teacher in this space? So I need to know that there's external influence that influence my classroom. I don't control everything. What happens for students outside of the classroom impacts their learning inside of the classroom. I needed to think about really established, really important pedagogical approaches. I needed to set up conditions for learning. It almost didn't matter what I did or how I taught if I hadn't paid attention to developing relationships and to the learning environment. These had a really significant impact. And then always retaining a focus on outcomes, remembering that my students are going to become primary school teachers, so there are professional outcomes that are important. But in global citizenship education, the personal outcomes are just as important because who they become and who they are as human beings impacts our world around us. So that's part A. Part B was the planning tool, because I had to figure out how to do it. So it's not enough just to know what are the skills that I need to develop, but I need to know how to do that. So this planning tool helps me to know what do I need to do in every lesson to make sure that I'm teaching all of these skills, because some students are really motivated and passionate about learning about gender inequality. Other students don't care and they're really passionate about financial justice. So whatever the topic, I needed to make sure I was hitting all of these critical global learning skills. So just really briefly, It's all within a cone that tells us our conditions for learning. We need to set them up first. We need that structure of the cone. The 4 balls going within the cone are the 4 elements of every lesson needs. So we need content. We need challenging content that challenges the status quo and their possible misconceptions that they might have about global issues about the world. We do this through direct and indirect teaching. We needed a space for individual work where students could personalize issues, where they could reflect on issues, where they could consider how what I was teaching them interacted with their experiences and their belief system. We needed group work. So remember, I'm working with really big groups, over 60 of them in a room. So if I want every student to have an opportunity to speak, I need to build group work into it. So they sit in groups of 4, and every single lesson has an opportunity at least once, but usually 2 or 3 times for them to work as a small group. So everybody gets a chance to talk, and I'm showing them that I care about and I'm honoring all of their voices, even if I can't hear all of them in that context. And the last piece is whole class work, so they know they're going to have to feed back. So if you do anything in a small group, you have to give it back and to the bigger group as well. So it has that responsibility that we're all part of creating that learning space, not just me. And then our outcomes are down at the bottom. This is what comes out of it: personal, professional, and then I have to do an assessment as well because it's formal education. So those pieces. So that's our framework that we have. I've talked to you a little bit about the context. So my context that I designed this conceptual framework for is large cohort and large group teaching. It's not ideal. It's not what I would design if I had the choice, but it's what I have. The profile of students in initial teacher education in Ireland is really significant and important, and could do a whole other presentation on that, but the vast majority of our students come from white, middle class, settled backgrounds, predominantly from Catholic or Christian backgrounds. So this has a significant impact on what they bring into the learning space that I needed to be conscious and aware of. It is developed for in-person rather than online teaching. I was really lucky that I finished data collection in 2019, and I didn't have to then think through how to do this for the online space when it was developed. And it was one framework being used by 2 people to teach the same content as well. So when I developed the framework, my dream all along was to do what I'm doing now. So when I developed the framework, I designed it to be open to change and evolution. So I never wanted it to be closed and finished and finite. So I think that those 2 arcs on our model can be expanded. We can put extra circles onto that. We can remove some circles. We can change it about. It's a moving shape. In our planning tool with the cone, we can put more balls into that cone. We can, we can change it around. We can change its structure. So I wanted this framework to be a starting point. It works for me in my context, but that doesn't mean it's exactly right for other people in other contexts. So as we learn more, as I listen to other researchers find out new things about global citizenship education and critical thinking, I want us to adapt and change. And most importantly, what I'm doing now is developing a research project doing just this. So I am in the process of this research project, the very early stages of it at the moment, to look at adapting the framework for diverse contexts. So my aim is I want to prove that it's possible. So I want to demonstrate that we can take an established and research-informed conceptual framework and adapt it. So acknowledging that even though something is structured and research-informed, it doesn't mean it's perfect for everybody, but we can adapt it and change it. And I want to prove that that's possible, and I want to show people how it can be done. So the outcomes I'm hoping for is evidence that the framework can be adapted and how to do so. So I'm hoping I don't know if it's going to be possible. I'm hoping it's going to be possible at the moment is the space I'm in. And I want to provide practical examples and suggested steps for incorporating the framework into different contexts. So my goal is to have both academic published pieces, but also more practitioner-based publications, almost like workbook style, that allow people to walk themselves through the journey of adapting and looking at how it relates to their own work and context. So far, I'm working with an Irish NGO called STAND. So STAND work in the non-formal education sector. They also work with the same cohort of students in that they're all university students, but it's non-formal education. They're not classroom based. They have projects that are not module based. So it's an entirely different context in lots of ways. They don't have the same profile of students that I have, and some of their work is online, for example. So we've begun the process of adapting my framework, or looking at my framework in the context of what they actually do on the ground. I'm in the midst of applying for ethical approval for this and a larger research project around this, and also in the midst of applying for funding, because I want to make sure that I give this the time that it needs. So I have a call after this conference with my university about the budget for that funding proposal. So hopefully that one goes through. So what do I want to do next? So the reason I wanted to come and talk at this conference about this is I'm hoping there might be some people in the audience who are interested. So if you're interested in critical thinking, I'm looking to recruit after ethical approval, so sometime later this year, a teacher educator who's not based in Ireland, a primary school teacher, a post-primary school teacher, and also an academic who's not working in teacher education. So I want to look at, and I already am working with an NGO in the non-formal education space, as I said. So my hope is that the working with these people in diverse contexts, we can look at how that framework I presented to you can be adapted in different ways for the different contexts. So for anyone who's interested in being involved, volunteering, and I'll send details through the network later as well. I'd provide you support around the framework. I would provide, support around going through it in detail. We would do focus groups with each other to learn from each other and learn how different contexts necessitate different components from the ones that I developed for my context. So thank you very much. And there is my email address if anybody wants to get in contact, but I'll keep an eye on that Padlet as well, which is a great way of hearing. So thank you.